The scent hit her first, before she even saw the coat. Alina stood in the hallway of Camden House with her husband's coat in her hands, ready to pass it to the servant, when a soft trace of perfume rose from the fabric. It was not her perfume. It was sweeter, heavier, the kind worn by someone who wanted to be remembered. She held the coat a moment longer than she should have. Her fingers pressed into the wool as if she could squeeze the truth out of it. Then she folded it calmly and handed it to the waiting servant, her face giving nothing away. That was a skill she had learned well in 6 years of marriage to Edward Whitmore, Duke of Camden. A duchess did not show her feelings in the hallway. A duchess did not show her feelings anywhere, unless she chose to. But inside, something had cracked. She walked to the drawing room and sat by the window, watching the carriage that had brought Edward home roll away down the long drive. He had told her he was at a meeting with his solicitor about the northern estate. He had told her this at breakfast, looking her straight in the eyes while he spread butter on his toast, as calm as a man discussing the weather. Alina had believed him. She always believed him. That was the trouble. She thought back over the last few months, turning the pieces over in her mind like stones in a river, looking for the one that did not belong. Edward's late evenings. The meetings that ran longer than meetings should. The way he had stopped reaching for her hand at dinner. The way his eyes drifted to the window when she spoke, as though he were listening to a voice only he could hear. She had told herself it was the pressure of running the estate. She had told herself he was tired. She had told herself many things because it was easier than telling herself the truth. The perfume on his coat would not let her hide anymore. A knock came at the door. Alina straightened her back and smoothed her skirts before she said, "Come in." It was Collins, the head of the household staff, an older man who had served the Whitmore family since before Edward was born. He carried a small silver tray with a single folded letter on it. "This came for His Grace, my lady," Collins said. "It was delivered by hand. I was told to bring anything addressed to him directly to his study, but his study is locked, and I did not wish to leave it lying about." Alina looked at the letter. It was not sealed with wax, the way formal letters usually were. It was simply folded, plain, almost careless, as if the sender had not thought anyone but Edward would ever see it. "Leave it with me," Alina said. "I will make sure he receives it." Collins hesitated for only a second, then bowed and left the room. Alina sat with the letter in her lap for a long time before she opened it. She told herself she should not. She told herself a wife did not read her husband's private letters, that trust was the foundation of any marriage, that if she opened this letter she could never again pretend she had not looked. Then she thought of the perfume on the coat, and she opened it anyway. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, sloped in a way that suggested confidence rather than manners. There was no name at the top, only a single line that struck Alina harder than any blow could have. "I counted the hours until you were here again. Tuesday cannot come soon enough." Alina read the line 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time as if repetition might change the words into something innocent, something explainable. A cousin, perhaps. A business partner eager for a meeting, but no cousin wrote like that. No business partner counted hours. She folded the letter along its original creases and placed it inside the drawer of the small writing desk near the window, the one where she kept her private correspondence. Her hands were steady. She noticed this and found it strange, that her hands could be so steady while her chest felt as though someone had reached inside and closed a fist around her heart. She did not cry. She had promised herself long ago that she would never let anyone see her cry over a man, not even in private, not even alone in a room with the curtains drawn. Crying felt like giving something away, and Alina had already given enough. That evening, Edward returned home just before dinner, kissing her cheek as he always did, smelling of leather and pipe smoke and something else underneath that she now recognized. She smiled at him. She asked about his day. He told her the meeting with the solicitor had run long, that the northern estate's tenants were causing trouble over the new grazing fees, that he was sorry to have kept her waiting for dinner. She listened to every word and believed none of it. "You seem tired," she said, watching his face carefully. "It has been a long day," Edward answered, not meeting her eyes for more than a moment. Nothing that a good meal and an early night will not fix. Elinor smiled again and said nothing more. She had learned in this one afternoon that watching was more powerful than asking. If she asked him directly, he would deny it, and she would have nothing but her own suspicion to stand on. If she watched, if she waited, if she gathered the pieces one by one, she would eventually have something no denial could undo. Dinner passed slowly. Edward spoke of the estate, of a horse he wished to purchase, of a letter from his mother, the Dowager Duchess, who was coming to visit at the end of the month. Elinor answered where she was expected to answer and smiled where she was expected to smile, and all the while her mind circled back to the letter in the drawer, to the perfume on the coat, to the word Tuesday, which was tomorrow. After dinner, Edward excused himself to his study, saying he had correspondence to finish before bed. Elinor watched him go, watched the study door close, and felt the strange sensation of watching a stranger walk through her own house. She went upstairs alone. She sat at her dressing table and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time, at the woman who had spent 6 years building a life around this man, this house, this name. She had been 18 when they married, dazzled by his title and his charm, and the way society had turned to look at her when she walked in on his arm. She had grown into her role slowly, learning which fork to use and which relatives to avoid, and how to run a household of 40 servants without ever raising her voice. She had never once imagined she would be sitting here, at 24, staring at her own reflection and wondering who her husband truly was. The next morning, Elinor woke early, before the house had fully stirred. She dressed simply and told her lady's maid she wished to visit her sister-in-law, Margaret, for the morning. This was not unusual. Elinor and Margaret had been close since the wedding, closer than most sisters by blood, let alone by marriage. The carriage ride to Margaret's townhouse took only 20 minutes, but Elinor spent every one of them rehearsing what she would say, and then abandoning each version as too dramatic, too calm, too revealing. Margaret received her in the small sitting room at the back of the house, the one that caught the morning sun. She took one look at Elinor's face and set down her teacup. "What has happened?" Margaret asked. Elinor sat across from her, folded her hands in her lap and told her everything. The perfume, the letter, the word Tuesday. She spoke without tears, without raising her voice, the way she had trained herself to speak about everything that mattered too much. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Elinor finished, Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence Elinor understood something that frightened her more than the letter itself. Margaret was not surprised. "You knew," Elinor said softly, "or you suspected." Margaret's eyes softened with something close to guilt. "There have been whispers, Elinor. I did not want to believe them, and I did not want to bring them to you without proof. Whispers can ruin a woman's peace for nothing." "Whispers about whom?" Margaret hesitated, then said the name that would soon become the center of Elinor's every waking thought. "Isabel Cross, a widow recently arrived from the north. She has been seen at several gatherings this season, always where Edward happens to be as well. I told myself it was coincidence. Society is small and everyone attends the same events." Elinor felt the fist around her heart tighten further. "Tuesday," she whispered. "The letter said Tuesday." Margaret reached across and took her hand. "What will you do?" Elinor looked out the window at the quiet street, at the ordinary world going about its ordinary business, unaware that hers had just been shaken to its foundation. "I do not know yet," Elinor said, "but I intend to find out the truth, all of it, before I decide anything." She left Margaret's house an hour later with a plan already forming in her mind, one she had not shared even with her closest friend. Tomorrow was Tuesday, and for the first time in her marriage, Elinor intended to know exactly where her husband went and exactly who was waiting for him there. The carriage rolled back toward Camden House, and Elinor sat very still, watching the city pass by the window, feeling something inside her shift from grief into resolve. She had spent 6 years being patient, being graceful, being everything a duchess was supposed to be. She was beginning to understand that patience alone would not save her marriage, if there was anything left of it worth saving. Whatever waited for her on Tuesday, she intended to face it with open eyes. Tuesday arrived gray and quiet, with a light rain falling over the city that seemed to match the heaviness in Aliner's chest. She rose early, before Edward, and watched him from beneath half-closed eyes as he dressed for the day. He moved with more care than usual, choosing his waistcoat twice, straightening his collar in the mirror longer than a man simply attending to a state business would need to. He kissed her forehead before he left, murmured something about a meeting near the Eastern District, and told her not to wait dinner for him if he was delayed. Aliner smiled sleepily and told him to take care on the wet roads. The moment the bedroom door closed behind him, her eyes were fully open, and her mind was already moving. She rang for her maid, a young woman named Alice who had served her faithfully since the first year of her marriage, and asked her to fetch the plainest dress in her wardrobe, one without any of the embroidery or fine trim that marked her as a duchess. Alice's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she said nothing, only did as she was asked. Within the hour, Aliner left Camden House through the side entrance, wrapped in a plain gray cloak with the hood pulled up against the rain, looking for all the world like any ordinary woman of the city rather than the Duchess of Camden. She had arranged for a hired carriage rather than her own, one that would not carry the Whitmore crest on its door, and she instructed the driver to follow at a distance behind the carriage that had carried her husband away that morning. It was not difficult to track him. Edward's carriage was well known, with its particular shade of dark green paint and the pair of matched grays that pulled it, and the Eastern District was not so large that a carriage could easily disappear. Aliner watched from her hired carriage as Edward's gray slowed and stopped in front of a modest but elegant townhouse on a quiet street, far from any solicitor's office or estate business she could imagine. The house had window boxes filled with late-season flowers and curtains of pale yellow silk, the kind of home a woman of taste and limited but comfortable means might keep. She watched her husband step down from his carriage, glance quickly up and down the street in a manner that told her everything she needed to know about his intentions, and knock at the door. The door opened before he had even lowered his hand. Aliner's breath caught as she watched the woman who answered. She was younger than Aliner had expected, though perhaps not younger than Aliner herself, with dark hair pulled into a simple but flattering style, and a face that held a kind of open warmth Aliner had once seen in her own mirror, years ago, before marriage and duty had smoothed her features into something more composed and less alive. The woman smiled at Edward in a way that Aliner recognized instantly, because it was the way Aliner herself had once smiled at him, before the smiles became habits rather than feelings. Edward stepped inside, and the yellow door closed behind him. Aliner sat in the hired carriage for what felt like hours, but was likely no more than 20 minutes, staring at that yellow door, feeling something inside her go very cold and very still. She had come seeking proof, and she had found it faster and more completely than she had ever wanted. She did not go to the door. She did not demand entry or make a scene in the street. Instead, she instructed her driver to take her home, and she spent the ride back to Camden House with her hands folded tightly in her lap, memorizing every detail of the street, the house, the yellow curtains, the woman's face, so that none of it could ever be denied to her later. That evening, Edward returned home just after 7, apologizing for the delay, explaining that the meeting with his solicitor had run far longer than expected due to a dispute over boundary lines on the eastern property. Aliner listened to the lie with a calm she did not know she possessed, nodding at the appropriate moments, asking a single question about the boundary dispute that he answered with practiced ease, as though he had prepared the story in advance. She realized, watching him eat his dinner and speak of his fictional meeting, that he was very good at this. Not the affair itself, perhaps, though he seemed skilled enough at that as well, but the lying. The smooth, unbothered way he wove a false day into believable shape. She wondered how many other stories he had told her over the years, how many other Tuesdays there had been that she had never thought to question. She did not confront him that night. She told herself it was patience, but in truth it was something closer to fear. Fear of what confrontation might unleash. Fear of hearing him admit it aloud and having no way to unhear it. Fear of the life she knew crumbling before she had a plan for what would come after. Over the following 2 weeks, Elinor became a careful observer of her own marriage, watching it as though it belonged to someone else. She noted the pattern of Edward's absences, always framed as a state business, always falling on Tuesdays and sometimes Fridays as well. She noted the particular way he checked his pocket watch when he thought she was not looking, counting the hours until he could leave for the yellow house on the quiet street. She began keeping a small private journal, hidden inside the lining of her jewelry box, recording dates and times and small details, not because she planned to use it as evidence in any formal sense, but because writing it down made it feel real, made it feel like something she was doing rather than something merely happening to her. She also began to ask careful, casual questions among her social circle, questions phrased so lightly that no one would suspect their true purpose. At a tea with several ladies of her acquaintance, she mentioned offhandedly that she had heard a new widow had arrived in the city, and wondered aloud who she might be. "Oh, that would be Isabel Cross," said Lady Whitfield, a woman known throughout society for knowing everyone's business before they knew it themselves. "Widow of a merchant from the north, I believe. Came into a fair amount of money when he passed, though not so much that she does not need to marry again eventually. She has been quite popular at gatherings this season. Very charming, they say." "Charming," Elinor repeated, keeping her voice light. "I have not yet had the pleasure." "I am sure you will," Lady Whitfield said, with a small smile that Elinor could not quite read. A smile that made her wonder uncomfortably whether Lady Whitfield already knew more than she was saying. Elinor left the tea with the name confirmed, and a growing certainty that she was likely not the only person in society who suspected what was happening, even if no one had yet dared to say it plainly to her face. This realization brought a fresh wave of humiliation, the thought that other women in her circle might be watching her with quiet pity, whispering about the Duchess who did not seem to know what her own husband was doing. That humiliation hardened something in her. She had spent 2 weeks watching and gathering and saying nothing, and she began to understand that this approach, while useful for learning the truth, could not continue indefinitely. Silence protected her from the pain of confrontation, but it also protected Edward from any consequence at all. He continued his Tuesdays and his Fridays exactly as before, secure in the belief that his wife noticed nothing, that his careful lies were working exactly as intended. Elinor decided she needed more than suspicion and second-hand gossip. She needed to see, with her own eyes and beyond any doubt, the full truth of what existed between her husband and Isabel Cross, and she needed to understand how deep it ran, how long it had lasted, and whether there was anything left in her marriage worth trying to save before she took any irreversible step. She thought of the letter still hidden in her writing desk, the one that spoke of counting hours until Tuesday came. She retrieved it one evening while Edward was away at his club, and she read it again, searching now not for the shock of discovery but for clues. The handwriting was confident, the tone intimate but not desperate, the words of a woman who felt secure in her position rather than one merely hoping for attention. This was not new. Whatever this was, it had existed long enough for Isabel Cross to feel entirely comfortable in it. Elinor's next step came from an unexpected direction. Her lady's maid, Alice, who had grown increasingly troubled by her mistress's quiet distress over the past weeks, finally worked up the courage one evening to speak. "My lady," Alice said, as she brushed out Elinor's hair before bed, "I do not wish to speak out of turn, but I believe you deserve to know something. My cousin works in service at a house in the Eastern District. She has mentioned, once or twice, seeing his Grace's carriage there on more than one occasion. She did not know I would recognize the description, but I did." Elinor met Alice's eyes in the mirror. "How long has your cousin worked at that house?" "Nearly a year, my lady." "A year?" Elinor absorbed this number slowly, feeling it settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward through everything she thought she understood about her marriage. A year meant this had begun long before she had noticed the perfume on the coat. A year meant an entire 12 months of Tuesdays and Fridays, of lies told over dinner, of kisses on her forehead from lips that had touched someone else's just hours before. "Thank you, Alice," Elinor said quietly. "You may go, and Alice, I would ask that this remain between us for now." "Of course, my lady, always." Alone that night, Elinor sat by her window long after the house had gone silent, staring out at the dark garden below, turning the number over and over in her mind. A year. She thought of every dinner, every evening by the fire, every moment she had believed her marriage to be simply tired rather than broken, and she understood now that she had been living inside a lie for far longer than she had realized. She thought, too, of Isabel Cross's face at the yellow door, the openness and warmth in her smile, and wondered whether that woman knew Edward was married at all, or whether she too had been deceived in her own way, told some story that made her feel less like the other woman and more like the true one. It was possible, Elinor realized, that there were two women being lied to in this arrangement, not one, though only one of them yet knew it. This thought did not soften her anger toward Edward. If anything, it sharpened it. A man who could deceive two women at once, who could build an entire second life in a yellow house while maintaining the appearance of devotion in his own, was not a man overtaken by a moment of weakness. He was a man who had planned, who had maintained, who had lied with skill and patience for a full year, without a single crack showing in his performance. Elinor understood, sitting there in the dark, that she was no longer simply gathering information. She was preparing herself, piece by piece, for whatever came next. She did not yet know what form her response would take, whether it would be quiet and private or something else entirely. But she knew with growing certainty that she would not spend another year as she had spent the last one, smiling at a man across the dinner table while he counted the hours until Tuesday. The following morning she began, without quite admitting it to herself, to plan. 3 days later, an invitation arrived for a garden party hosted by Lord and Lady Ferris, one of the largest social gatherings of the early summer season. Elinor had attended this party every year of her marriage, and she nearly declined this time, uncertain whether she could bear an afternoon of smiling faces and idle conversation while her private world remained in ruins. But then she considered the guest list, which Lady Whitfield had mentioned in passing included several of the newer families in society, and something told her Isabel Cross would likely be among them. She was right. Elinor spotted her within minutes of arriving, standing near the rose arbor in a pale blue dress that suited her dark hair beautifully, laughing at something said by an older gentleman Elinor did not recognize. There was nothing in Isabel's manner that suggested guilt or secrecy. She moved through the party with the easy confidence of a woman who belonged, who had nothing to hide, and this, more than anything Elinor had seen so far, unsettled her deeply. A woman engaged in a secret affair with a married duke should carry some trace of unease, some flicker of caution. Isabel Cross carried none. Elinor kept her distance for the first hour, speaking with acquaintances, accepting compliments on her dress, playing her part exactly as she had for 6 years. She watched, always watched, tracking the movement of the party like a hawk circling above a field, waiting for the moment Edward would arrive. He arrived just past 2 in the afternoon, having told Elinor that morning he would be delayed by business at his club. He walked into the garden alone, scanning the crowd, and Elinor watched his eyes find Isabel Cross before they found his own wife. It was only a fraction of a second, the smallest possible pause, but Elinor saw it, and something inside her that had still been holding onto a thread of hope finally let go. She approached him first, before he could reach for the rose arbor, taking his arm with a warm smile that fooled everyone watching, including, she suspected, Edward himself. "There you are," she said pleasantly. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten me entirely." "Never," he said, kissing her cheek. "The club ran long, you know how these things go." "I do," Elinor said, and let the words carry more weight than he could possibly understand. They walked together through the party, greeting friends, admiring Lady Ferris's roses, and Elinor made certain, with the careful skill of a woman who had spent 6 years learning the choreography of society, that their path crossed near the rose arbor at exactly the right moment. "Your Grace," Isabel Cross said, curtsying to Alina with perfect propriety. "And Your Grace," she added, nodding to Edward with a formality that struck Alina as almost theatrical in its correctness, as though the two of them had rehearsed exactly how strangers ought to behave. "Mrs. Cross," Edward said, his voice steady, his face giving away nothing at all, "I do not believe you have met my wife." "I have not had the pleasure," Isabel said, turning her warm smile onto Alina. "Your Grace, I have heard nothing but wonderful things about you. The whole city speaks of your kindness." Alina studied her for a long moment, searching her face for any sign of discomfort, any flicker of guilt beneath the pleasant words. She found nothing. Either Isabel Cross was a remarkably skilled performer, or she genuinely believed she had done nothing that required guilt at all. "How kind of you to say," Alina replied, her voice as smooth and warm as Isabel's own. "And how are you finding the city, Mrs. Cross? I understand you are newly arrived." "Nearly a year now," Isabel said. "Though it feels as though I have been here far longer, the city has been very welcoming." A year. There it was again, the same number Alice had given her, confirmed now from the very source of Alina's pain, spoken with such casual ease that Alina nearly admired the woman's composure, even as she despised what it represented. They spoke for a few more minutes of nothing important, of the weather and the roses and a concert planned for the following week, and then Isabel excused herself to speak with another guest, and Alina watched her walk away with a small, private smile that Alina was almost certain was meant for Edward, though he gave no outward response at all. "A pleasant woman," Alina said lightly, as they continued their walk through the garden. "I suppose," Edward said, his voice carefully neutral, "I have met her once or twice at various functions." Once or twice. Alina filed this lie away with all the others, adding it to the growing collection she carried in her mind, and said nothing more on the subject for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, after Edward had retired to his study, Alina sat with Margaret in the drawing room, describing the encounter in careful detail. Margaret listened with growing concern, her earlier hesitance to believe the rumors now entirely gone. "You must confront him," Margaret said. "Alina, you cannot continue watching this play out from the shadows. It is destroying you." "I know," Alina said, "but I want to understand the full shape of it first. If I confront him too soon, he will simply deny everything, and I will have won nothing but his denial. I need something he cannot argue away." "And what would that be?" Alina considered the question carefully. "I do not yet know. But I intend to find out." It was Margaret, in the end, who suggested the idea that would give Alina exactly what she needed. Margaret's husband, Edward's younger brother, had once employed a discreet man of business to look into a matter of estate fraud among the tenants, a man who specialized in quiet, careful inquiry that never drew public attention. Margaret offered to arrange an introduction. 2 days later, Alina met with a man named Charles Bennet in a private room at a respectable inn, far from any location where she might be recognized. He was a plain, unremarkable-looking man, the kind who could disappear into any crowd, which she suspected was precisely why he was so good at his work. "I need to understand the full history of an arrangement," Alina told him, keeping her voice steady despite the strange humiliation of having to say the words aloud to a stranger. "How long it has existed, what has been spent on it, and whether there are any further complications I should be aware of." Charles Bennet nodded without judgment, took a few careful notes, and asked only the questions necessary to understand his task. He gave her his fee, promised discretion, and told her he would have preliminary findings within a fortnight. The fortnight passed slowly. Alina continued her outward performance of a contented duchess, attending teas and dinners, and one uncomfortable evening at the opera where she sat beside Edward in their private box and watched, from the corner of her eye, as his attention drifted more than once to a box across the theater where Isabel Cross sat with a group of friends, radiant in green silk. When Charles Bennet finally sent word that his findings were ready, Alina arranged another quiet meeting, this time at Margaret's townhouse, where she could receive the news without fear of being observed. What Charles Bennet told her was worse than anything she had imagined. The arrangement between Edward and Isabel Cross had indeed begun over a year ago, shortly before Isabel's arrival in the city was even publicly known. Edward had, in fact, arranged for the lease on the Yellow House himself, paying for it quietly through a solicitor who handled such matters for several gentlemen of the ton, a practice common enough that no one thought twice about the arrangement. He had furnished the house, paid for Isabel's wardrobe, and settled a monthly allowance on her that exceeded what many respectable families lived on entirely. But the detail that struck Alina hardest, the one that made the room around her seem to tilt and blur for a long moment, was the final piece of information Charles Bennet delivered with quiet, careful professionalism. "There is also this, Your Grace," he said. "Mrs. Cross has recently begun consulting with a physician known for attending to matters of childbirth. My source, a maid within the household, believes she is with child." Alina sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, and felt the last remaining piece of her old life crumble away entirely. A child, Edward's child in all likelihood, growing inside a woman who was not his wife, in a house he had paid for with money that belonged, in every sense that mattered, to the Whitmore estate and the Whitmore name. Alina herself had given Edward no children in 6 years of marriage, not for lack of trying but simply through the cruel indifference of fate, and she had spent countless private hours grieving that absence, wondering if something within her had failed. Now she understood, with a bitterness that tasted like ash in her mouth, that Edward had apparently found no such patience for waiting on fate with another woman. "Thank you, Mr. Bennet," she managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. "You have been most thorough." "I am sorry to bring you such news, Your Grace," Charles Bennet said, and for the first time since she had met him, something like genuine sympathy crossed his plain features. Alina left the meeting and returned to Margaret's sitting room, where her sister-in-law took one look at her face and rose immediately to embrace her, asking no questions until Alina was ready to speak. When Alina finally told her everything, Margaret's expression hardened into something Alina had never seen on her gentle face before, a cold and quiet fury that matched, in its own way, the storm building inside Alina herself. "This changes everything," Margaret said. "Alina, he cannot be allowed to continue as though nothing has happened. A child changes the shape of this entirely. If it becomes known, and these things always become known eventually, the scandal will fall on you as much as on him, simply for having stayed silent." Alina understood this with painful clarity. Society was not always fair in how it distributed blame. A duke's infidelity might be whispered about with a kind of resigned acceptance, as though it were simply the nature of powerful men, but a duchess who knew and said nothing, who continued to smile and host dinners while her husband kept a mistress and a growing family across the city, would be judged far more harshly, painted as either foolish or complicit, neither of which Alina could bear to have said of her. "I need time to decide how to proceed," Alina said. "This cannot be rushed. If I act too quickly, out of anger alone, I may lose whatever advantage I have gathered." "And if you wait too long," Margaret said gently, "you may lose the chance to act at all before the child arrives and the situation becomes public on its own." Alina knew her sister-in-law was right. The quiet phase of her plan, the watching and gathering, was drawing to its natural end. Somewhere ahead of her lay a moment of reckoning, one she could delay but not avoid forever, and the knowledge of the child growing in that yellow house told her the reckoning would need to come soon, before the world made the choice for her. That night Alina sat once again at her writing desk, the hidden journal open before her, and she wrote down everything Charles Bennet had told her, every detail, every date, every figure, building a record that no denial could ever dismantle. When she finished, she closed the journal, locked it away, and looked at her own reflection in the dark window glass, searching for the woman she had been before all of this began. She was still there, somewhere beneath the calm composure and the careful smiles. Alina could feel her, waiting, gathering strength, preparing for whatever came next. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered on heavy cream paper with the royal seal pressed into the wax, announcing the grandest event of the season, a summer ball to be hosted by the Duke and Duchess of Camden themselves at Camden House, in honor of the visiting foreign dignitaries currently touring the capital. Every notable family in the city would attend. It was, without question, the single most important social event Alina and Edward had ever hosted together. Alina read the confirmation of the date twice, feeling the strange weight of timing settle over her like a second skin. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks before the entire world she moved through would gather beneath her own roof. And somewhere in that gathering, she suspected, Isabel Cross would be present as well, since the guest list for an event of this size stretched wide enough to include most of the newer families in society who had established themselves with wealth or connection. That evening, Alina decided the time for silent observation had finally come to its end. She waited until dinner was cleared and the servants had withdrawn, and she asked Edward to join her in the drawing room rather than retiring immediately to his study. He seemed surprised by the request but agreed easily enough, settling into the chair across from her with a glass of brandy in hand, entirely unaware of what was coming. "Edward," Alina said, keeping her voice level, "I want to speak with you about something, and I would ask that you answer me honestly." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of caution that told Alina he sensed the conversation was not going to be about the ball or the household accounts. "Of course," he said. "What is it? How well do you know Isabel Cross?" The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but Alina felt every one of them stretch out like hours. Edward's face did not change dramatically, no wide eyes or dropped glass, only the smallest tightening around his mouth that she had learned, over 6 years, to recognize as the sign of a man choosing his words with great care. "I have met her at several gatherings this season," he said. "As I mentioned before, why do you ask?" "Because I have seen your carriage outside her house on the Eastern District Street, more than once, on days when you told me you were meeting with your solicitor." Edward set down his brandy glass with deliberate slowness. "Alina, I do not know what you believe you have seen, but I assure you, there is nothing improper in any acquaintance I have with Mrs. Cross. She is a widow, new to society, and I have on occasion offered guidance regarding certain financial matters, as a courtesy to a woman without a husband to advise her." "Financial matters," Alina repeated. "Is that what you call the lease you arranged on her house, the allowance you settled on her?" "The physician she has recently begun consulting." Edward's face went pale, the careful composure finally cracking just slightly at the edges. "Who has told you these things?" "Does it matter who told me, Edward, or does it only matter that I know?" He rose from his chair and walked to the window, his back to her, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Alina watched him, waiting, refusing to fill the silence with anything that might give him an easier path toward another lie. "Alina," he finally said, still facing the window, "I never intended for you to be hurt by any of this." It was not a denial. It was, in its own quiet way, a confession, and Alina felt something inside her chest both break and settle at the same time, the strange relief of finally hearing the truth mixed with the fresh pain of hearing it confirmed. "How long, Edward? Does the length of time truly matter now?" "It matters to me," Alina said, her voice sharper than she intended. "It matters because I have spent that time believing myself to be your wife in every sense that counted, and I have learned instead that I have been sharing my marriage with a woman I did not even know existed." Edward turned to face her then, and for the first time in longer than Alina could remember, she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression, something that might have been shame, though she was too wounded to fully trust her own reading of it. "It began just over a year ago," he admitted quietly. "I did not plan for it, I did not seek it out. I met her at a dinner hosted by Lord Ferris, and something about her made me feel, I do not know how to explain it, made me feel as though I could breathe again, after years of feeling as though every part of my life had been arranged for me before I was even born. And what of me, Edward? Did you feel as though I had been arranged for you as well? Is that what 6 years of marriage has meant to you, an arrangement you tolerated until something more appealing came along? That is not fair, Edward said, though his voice lacked conviction. I have cared for you, Alina, I still do. You have cared for me the way one cares for a well-kept house, Alina said, her composure finally beginning to crack, though she refused to let the tears fall in front of him. Comfortable, familiar, expected. But you did not choose me the way you chose her, did you? You did not count the hours until Tuesday came for my sake. Edward said nothing, and his silence was its own answer. There is a child, Alina said, and watched his face confirm what Charles Bennet had already told her, the way his eyes closed briefly, the way his shoulders dropped, not in surprise but in the particular exhaustion of a man whose careful arrangement of lies had finally collapsed entirely. Alina, I never wanted you to learn of this in such a manner. How did you want me to learn of it, Edward? Was there a manner you had planned that would have caused me less pain? Or did you simply hope I would never learn of it at all, that I would continue hosting your dinners and smiling at your side, while you built an entire second family across the city? Edward crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, reaching for her hands, but Alina pulled them away before he could touch her. I do not know what I hoped, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I have been a coward, Alina. I see that now. I told myself I could keep both parts of my life separate, that neither would ever touch the other, but I see now how foolish that was. Foolish, Alina repeated softly. Yes, it was foolish. But not for the reasons you believe. She stood, forcing him to rise as well, putting distance between them that felt, in that moment, like the only honest thing left in the room. I do not yet know what I intend to do, Edward, she said. But I will tell you this. I will not continue pretending in front of our household, in front of society, in front of myself, that nothing has changed. Whatever comes next, I intend to face it with my eyes fully open, and I would advise you to prepare yourself for that as well. She left him standing alone in the drawing room and climbed the stairs to her bedchamber, where she sat once again by the window, staring out at the dark garden, feeling strangely calmer than she had felt in weeks. The confrontation, painful as it had been, had at least stripped away the last of the uncertainty. She knew everything now. There were no more shadows left to investigate, no more careful questions to ask at teas and garden parties. What remained was only the question of what she intended to do with the truth she now fully possessed. Over the following days, Edward attempted, in his own clumsy way, to make amends. He sent flowers to her private sitting room, a gesture so thoroughly inadequate to the situation that Alina nearly laughed when she saw them. He canceled what she assumed were his usual Tuesday and Friday appointments, staying home instead, hovering near her with an anxious attentiveness that felt less like genuine remorse, and more like a man trying to manage a crisis before it grew beyond his control. Alina allowed him to believe, for the sake of her own plans, that his efforts were having some effect. She softened her manner slightly at dinner, accepted his small gestures with polite gratitude, and gave no outward sign of the resolve hardening within her with each passing day. She spent those days instead in quiet preparation, meeting with Margaret to discuss what might come, reviewing her hidden journal, and thinking carefully about the ball now looming 2 weeks ahead, an event that would gather every important family in society beneath her own roof, an event where Isabel Cross, given the size and reach of the guest list, might very well be present. Alina began to understand, as the days passed, that the ball might offer her something she had not initially considered when the invitations were first sent. It would offer her an audience. And for the first time since discovering the perfume on Edward's coat, Alina found herself considering not whether to act, but how and where, and in front of whom. The days leading up to the ball passed in a blur of preparation. Camden House filled with the sounds of hammering as workmen constructed a temporary dance floor in the great hall, and the scent of fresh flowers drifted through every corridor as arrangements arrived by the cartload from the finest gardens in the county. Alina threw herself into the planning with an energy that surprised even her own household staff, overseeing every detail from the placement of candles to the selection of music. And if anyone noticed a new sharpness in her eyes, a new steadiness in her voice when she gave instructions, no one dared to remark upon it. Margaret visited often during those final 2 weeks, ostensibly to help with preparations, but truly to check on Alina's state of mind. She found her sister-in-law calm, almost unnervingly so, moving through the mounting chaos of the ball's preparation with the composed efficiency of a general planning, a campaign, rather than a hostess planning a party. "You seem different," Margaret said one afternoon, as they sat together reviewing the final seating arrangements for the formal dinner that would precede the dancing. "I feel different," Alina admitted. "I have spent weeks feeling as though the ground beneath me had turned to sand, shifting and uncertain with every step. Now I feel as though I am standing on solid stone again, even if the view from where I stand is not one I would have chosen." Margaret reached over and squeezed her hand. "Whatever you decide to do, Alina, I will stand beside you." "You know that." "I know," Alina said, and found herself grateful, not for the first time, that she had a sister in Margaret even without the bond of blood. The guest list for the ball had grown, as such lists often did, far beyond its original scope. What had begun as an intimate gathering in honor of the visiting dignitaries had swelled into an event that would draw nearly every notable family in the city, along with a significant number of the newer arrivals who had established themselves through wealth and ambition rather than ancient lineage. Alina reviewed the final list 3 days before the event and found, exactly as she had suspected, the name she had been both dreading and, in some strange way, anticipating. Isabel Cross had been invited, though not by Alina herself. The invitation had gone out weeks earlier, before Alina had learned the full truth, sent as a courtesy to a woman who had become a fixture of the season's social calendar, included on a list drawn up by Edward's secretary, without either Alina or Edward reviewing every individual name. Alina considered, briefly, whether to have the invitation quietly withdrawn, to spare herself the ordeal of hosting the very woman who had unraveled her marriage beneath her own roof. But the more she considered it, the more she understood that withdrawing the invitation would accomplish nothing, except delaying an inevitable reckoning, and might even raise questions among the sharper-eyed members of society, who would notice the sudden absence of a woman who had attended nearly every other major event of the season. No, Isabel Cross would attend, and Alina found, as she sat with that certainty, that some quiet part of herself was almost relieved. If the confrontation was coming regardless, better that it come on ground of her own choosing, in a house she knew intimately, surrounded by people whose opinions had shaped every year of her adult life. 3 days before the ball, Alina encountered Isabel Cross unexpectedly at a modest gathering hosted by Lady Ferris, a small tea meant to finalize plans for a charitable auction the following month. Alina had not expected Isabel to attend, as the guest list had been limited to a handful of women involved in the charity committee, but there she was, seated near the window with a teacup in hand, laughing softly at something one of the other women had said. Alina's first instinct was to turn and leave, to claim a sudden headache and retreat before she was noticed. But something steadied her, a quiet voice inside that told her this moment, however uncomfortable, might serve her better than she realized. She entered the room with her usual composed grace, and took the empty seat that happened to be nearest Isabel Cross. "Your Grace," Isabel said, rising slightly in greeting, "how lovely to see you again. I do hope the preparations for your ball are proceeding smoothly." "Quite smoothly, thank you," Alina said, accepting a cup of tea from the servant who circled the room. "We are all looking forward to it a great deal." "I am so honored to have received an invitation," Isabel continued, her tone light and entirely unguarded, as though she carried no secret at all. "I have heard Camden House is truly magnificent, especially when prepared for such an occasion." "It is," Alina agreed. "I have always found the Great Hall particularly beautiful when the candles are lit for an evening event. There is a quality to the light that photographs and paintings never quite capture. They spoke a while longer of trivial matters: the weather, the charity auction, a new play recently opened at the theater. And throughout the conversation, Alina studied Isabel Cross with the careful attention of a woman searching for cracks in a mask. She found, to her continued unease, remarkably few. Isabel laughed easily, spoke with genuine warmth, and showed no sign whatsoever of the guilt or discomfort Alina might have expected from a woman knowingly involved with another woman's husband. It occurred to Alina, watching her, that Isabel Cross might genuinely believe herself to be the wronged party in some version of events Edward had constructed for her, a story in which perhaps Alina was cold, or absent, or somehow deserving of betrayal, a story that made Isabel's own conscience easier to bear. This thought brought Alina no comfort, but it did bring a strange kind of clarity. Whatever Isabel Cross believed about her own role in this, the truth remained the same. She was carrying a child that belonged, by blood if not by name, to the Whitmore family, a child conceived while Edward remained legally and completely bound to his wife. As the tea drew to its close and the women began gathering their things, Isabel leaned slightly toward Alina, lowering her voice just enough to keep the words between the two of them. "Your Grace, I hope you will not think me forward, but I have always admired the grace with which you carry yourself. Society can be so unkind to women who do not fit its expectations perfectly, and yet you seem to move through it all with such ease. I only wish to say so." Alina met her eyes and offered a small, unreadable smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Cross. Grace is often simply the art of concealing what one truly feels. I imagine you understand that better than most." Something flickered across Isabel's face then, the first true crack Alina had glimpsed in her composure, a brief uncertainty that suggested, perhaps, the words had landed closer to their mark than Isabel expected. But it passed quickly, replaced by another warm smile, and the moment slipped away before either woman could say anything further. Alina left the gathering with her resolve, if anything, strengthened. Isabel Cross was not a fool, and some part of her clearly understood the true shape of the situation, whatever story she told herself to make it bearable. That understanding, however small, told Alina that, when the moment came, whatever moment it turned out to be, Isabel Cross would not be entirely unprepared for it either. 2 days before the ball, a final incident occurred that removed any lingering doubt Alina might have carried about her course of action. She had gone to Edward's study to discuss a matter of household accounts, entering without knocking, as she had done 1,000 times before in 6 years of marriage, and found him standing at his desk with a small velvet box open before him, examining a delicate gold bracelet set with pale blue stones. Edward startled at her entrance, snapping the box closed with a speed that told Alina everything she needed to know before he said a single word. "A gift for your mother's birthday," he said quickly, too quickly, the lie forming before he had even fully processed what he was saying. "My mother's birthday was in the spring, Edward," Alina said quietly. "It has already passed." He had no answer for that. He simply stood there, the box clutched in his hand, his face slowly draining of color as he understood there was no story left that could explain away what she had seen. Alina did not ask whom the bracelet was truly intended for. She did not need to. She turned and left the study without another word, closing the door softly behind her, and walked to her own private sitting room, where she sat for a long while, staring at nothing, feeling the last fragile thread of hope she had still been carrying, buried somewhere beneath her anger and her grief, finally slip away entirely. Even now, even after everything, even after the confrontation and his admission and the truth of the child, some small part of her had still been waiting for a sign that he was truly trying to change, truly trying to choose his marriage over whatever he had built with Isabel Cross. The bracelet told her that no such sign was coming. He would continue giving gifts to a woman across the city while his own wife hosted his ball, wore his ring, and carried his name. Alina rose from her chair and walked to her writing desk, opening the drawer where the original letter still lay hidden beneath a stack of her private correspondence. She read it one final time, the words no longer capable of wounding her the way they once had, and then she closed the drawer and turned her full attention to the 2 days remaining before the ball. She had spent weeks watching, gathering, and waiting. The waiting, she decided, standing alone in her sitting room with the evening light fading around her, was finally over. The night of the ball arrived beneath a clear sky scattered with stars, and Camden House blazed with light from every window, candles glowing in the great hall until the room seemed to shimmer like something out of a dream. Carriages lined the drive from the front gate all the way to the main steps, delivering guest after guest in silks and jewels, the finest families of the city arriving to see and be seen at what everyone already agreed was the finest event of the season. Alina stood at the top of the grand staircase beside Edward, greeting their guests as they arrived, playing the role of gracious hostess with a skill that no one watching could have guessed concealed anything beneath its surface. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk, chosen weeks earlier before any of this had begun, and around her neck hung a simple strand of pearls that had belonged to Edward's grandmother, passed down through generations of Whitmore duchesses. On her finger, as always, sat the ring Edward had given her on their wedding day, a large emerald surrounded by smaller diamonds, a ring she had worn every single day for 6 years without once removing it. Edward stood beside her, handsome in his formal evening wear, greeting old friends and important guests with the easy charm that had first drawn Alina to him so many years ago. To anyone watching, they appeared exactly as they always had, a golden couple at the height of their happiness, and Alina found a strange, bitter satisfaction in maintaining that illusion for just a little while longer, knowing what she now intended to do before the evening ended. Isabel Cross arrived just past 9, wearing a gown of deep green that made her dark hair and pale skin all the more striking, accompanied by a small group of friends from among the newer families in society. Alina watched her ascend the staircase from her position near the entrance to the great hall, watched the way Isabel's eyes found Edward across the crowded room before they found anyone else, and felt the last of her patience settle into something cold and certain. The dinner passed in a haze of conversation Alina barely registered, her mind occupied entirely with the plan forming in sharper and sharper detail with each passing hour. She sat at the head of the table beside Edward, exchanging pleasantries with the visiting dignitaries seated nearest her, smiling and laughing at appropriate moments, while somewhere across the long table, several seats down, Isabel Cross sat among the other guests, occasionally catching Edward's eye when she believed no one else was watching. After dinner, the guests moved into the great hall, where the orchestra had already begun tuning their instruments for the first dance. Edward, as tradition demanded, led Alina onto the floor for the opening waltz, and she moved through the steps with practiced grace, her body performing the familiar motions while her mind remained entirely elsewhere, counting down the hours, then the minutes, until the moment she had chosen would arrive. She had decided, in the quiet hours of the previous 2 nights, that she would not act during the early part of the evening, while the guests were still fresh and attentive, and every eye in the room might be drawn toward whatever occurred. She would wait instead until later, when the dancing had loosened the formality of the crowd, when enough guests had gathered in small groups throughout the hall that her chosen moment would draw the attention of many, but not the immediate, overwhelming focus of every single person present. She wanted witnesses. She did not want chaos so complete that the truth of what happened could later be twisted or forgotten in the retelling. Midnight approached, and the ball reached the height of its energy, the great hall filled with dancing couples, laughing groups near the refreshment tables, and the warm golden light of hundreds of candles reflecting off silk and jewels. Alina stood near the edge of the dance floor, having just finished a dance with Lord Ferris, when she saw Edward slip away from a conversation near the far wall, moving with the practiced casualness of a man who believed himself unobserved, toward the small alcove near the garden doors where Isabel Cross stood waiting. Alina watched from across the room as Edward reached the alcove, watched Isabel's face light up at his approach, watched the two of them exchange words too quiet to hear, but too intimate in their body language to mistake for anything innocent. Edward reached out and touched Isabel's hand, just briefly, just for a moment, but it was enough, in the golden candlelight of Alina's own ball, beneath the eyes of anyone who happened to glance in that direction. Elinor was not the only one who saw it. She noticed, from the corner of her eye, Lady Whitfield's sharp gaze following the same direction, and a small ripple of whispered conversation beginning among a cluster of guests standing near the alcove's edge. The scandal, it seemed, was already beginning to right itself, whether Elinor chose to act or not. She made her decision in that instant, feeling something settle inside her, cold and clear and absolutely certain. Elinor crossed the great hall with measured steps, her sapphire gown catching the candlelight as she moved, drawing eyes toward her simply by the elegant purpose in her stride. Conversations began to quiet as she passed, guests sensing without yet understanding that something significant was unfolding before them. By the time she reached the alcove near the garden doors, a considerable portion of the great hall had turned to watch, the orchestra faltering slightly as even the musicians noticed the sudden shift in the room's attention. Edward saw her coming and stepped back from Isabel with poorly concealed alarm, his easy charm evaporating in an instant, replaced by something closer to panic. "Elinor," he began, "I was simply—" "Do not," Elinor said quietly, her voice carrying more weight in its softness than any shout could have managed. "Do not tell me another story, Edward. I have heard enough of your stories to last a lifetime." The room had gone almost entirely silent now, the orchestra stopping altogether, hundreds of guests turning to watch the scene unfolding near the garden doors, drawn by the unmistakable tension crackling through the air. Isabel Cross stood frozen, her earlier composure entirely gone, her face pale beneath the golden candlelight. "Your Grace, I do not know what you believe." "I know everything, Mrs. Cross," Elinor said, turning her attention to the woman who had shared her husband's affections for over a year. "I know about the house on the Eastern District Street. I know about the allowance, the physician, the child you are carrying. I have known for some time now." A collective gasp moved through the nearest guests, the whisper of the word child rippling outward through the crowd faster than Elinor could have anticipated, reaching ears that had not even been close enough to hear the rest of the conversation clearly. "Elinor," Edward said, his voice desperate now, reaching for her arm, "please, not here, not like this. Let us discuss this privately." "We have discussed it privately, Edward," Elinor said, pulling her arm away from his grasp with a firmness that surprised even herself. "We discussed it in the drawing room, and you promised me things would change. And yet here you stand in our own home at our own ball, touching another woman's hand while I greet our guests upstairs. You have made your choice clear enough, Edward, over and over again, for more than a year. I am simply the last person in this room to fully understand it." The silence in the great hall had become absolute, broken only by the soft crackle of the candles and the distant sound of a servant dropping a tray somewhere in the kitchens below, the clatter echoing faintly through the sudden quiet. Elinor lifted her hand, the emerald ring catching the candlelight one final time, and she pulled it from her finger with a steady, deliberate motion. She looked at it for a moment, this symbol of 6 years of marriage, of promises made in a church before God and family, of a life she had built around a man who had apparently never valued it as she had. Then she turned to Isabel Cross, and in a voice that carried clearly across the entire silent hall, she said the words that would be repeated in drawing rooms across the city for months to come. "Keep him." She threw the ring, not violently, but with a controlled, deliberate force, and it landed at Isabel Cross's feet, the emerald glinting against the polished floor as it came to rest. For a long moment, no one in the great hall moved. Isabel stared down at the ring as though it might transform into something else if she looked at it long enough. Edward stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and horror, the careful composure that had carried him through a year of successful deception finally, completely, shattering before the eyes of everyone he had ever hoped to impress. Then Edward did something Elinor had never once seen him do in 6 years of marriage. He lost control entirely. "Elinor," he shouted, his voice cracking with a raw desperation that echoed through the silent hall, drawing every remaining eye toward him. "You cannot do this, not here, not like this, in front of everyone." "I have done nothing, Edward," Elinor said, her voice remaining calm even as his grew louder and more frantic. "I have simply stopped pretending. You are the one who built this. I am only the one finally willing to let everyone see it." "Please," Edward said, and to Elinor's genuine astonishment, he actually knelt, right there on the floor of the great hall in front of hundreds of guests, reaching for her hand. "Elinor, please, do not do this. I will end it, I swear to you. I will end everything with her, just do not do this here." Elinor looked down at her husband, the Duke of Camden, kneeling before her in front of the entire assembled society of the city, begging her not to abandon him now that his careful deception had finally collapsed, and she felt something that surprised her more than anything else that evening. She felt nothing at all. No triumph, no satisfaction, no lingering love pulling at her resolve. Only a vast, quiet emptiness where her marriage had once lived. "Stand up, Edward," she said quietly. "You are embarrassing yourself further, and I no longer have any interest in protecting you from that." He did not stand. He remained kneeling, his shoulders shaking, and somewhere in the crowd, a woman gasped audibly, while several others began whispering urgently to their companions, already composing in their minds the version of this story they would tell at breakfast tomorrow, and the day after, and for weeks to come. Isabel Cross, still standing frozen near the alcove, finally bent and picked up the ring from where it had landed, her hands trembling as she held it, staring at Elinor with an expression that mixed shock, humiliation, and something that might have been the first genuine flicker of shame Elinor had seen from her since this entire ordeal began. "Your Grace," Isabel said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I did not know, I promise you, when it began I did not know he was." "It does not matter now, Mrs. Cross," Elinor said, cutting her off gently but firmly. "Whatever you did or did not know then, you know everything now. What you choose to do with that knowledge is entirely your own affair." Elinor turned and walked away from them both, from her kneeling husband and his stunned mistress, from the ring lying abandoned in Isabel's shaking hand, and made her way through the parted crowd toward the grand staircase, her head held high, her steps steady, the great hall of Camden House utterly silent behind her except for the sound of her own heels against the polished floor. She reached the base of the staircase and paused for just a moment, looking back at the room full of stunned faces, at her husband still kneeling on the floor where she had left him, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after weeks of turmoil, that whatever came next, she would face it as herself, fully and completely, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Then she climbed the stairs and did not look back again. By the following morning, the story had already spread through the city faster than any messenger could have carried it, passed from servant to servant, from breakfast table to breakfast table, growing slightly with each retelling until half the city believed they had witnessed the scene themselves. Elinor remained in her private chambers for most of the morning, having instructed Alice to admit no one except Margaret, who arrived shortly after 10 with a face full of concern, and beneath it, something like fierce pride. "You are the talk of every household in the city," Margaret said, settling into the chair beside Elinor's bed. "Some are calling you scandalous for making a scene at your own ball. Others are calling you the bravest woman in society. I confess I have heard both opinions from the very same person within a single conversation." "I imagine Edward is receiving far worse," Elinor said quietly. "Far worse indeed," Margaret confirmed. "He has not left his study since the ball ended. Collins tells me he has refused all meals and has not slept. Several of his closest friends have already sent notes distancing themselves from any further association, and Lord Ferrous himself commented, I am told, that a man who cannot control himself before his own guests can hardly be trusted to manage an estate." Elinor absorbed this news without any particular satisfaction. She had expected consequence, had perhaps even hoped for it in her darkest private moments, but hearing it laid out so plainly brought her no joy, only a tired sort of confirmation that the life she had known truly was ending. "What of Mrs. Cross?" Elinor asked. "She left the ball almost immediately after you departed upstairs," Margaret said. "I am told she has not been seen since." Whether she has returned to the house on the Eastern District Street or fled the city entirely, no one seems to know for certain. Elinor nodded slowly, absorbing this information as well, and found herself, to her own surprise, hoping that Isabel Cross had found somewhere safe to go, some quiet place to consider what had happened and what would come next for her and the child she carried. Elinor's anger toward Edward remained sharp and unyielding, but her feelings toward Isabel had softened into something closer to weary pity, the recognition that two women had been deceived by the same man in different ways, and that only one of them yet carried the full weight of what came next inside her own body. Over the following days, Elinor began the practical work of untangling her life from Edward's. She met with a solicitor of her own choosing, a sharp and capable woman named Charlotte Winters, who had built a quiet reputation for handling delicate matters of separation among the city's wealthier families. Together they began the slow, careful process of determining what Elinor's position would be, what portion of the Whitmore estate she might claim as her own under the terms of her marriage settlement, and what steps would be necessary to formally separate her name and her future from the scandal that now surrounded her husband. Edward attempted, in the days following the ball, to reach her repeatedly. He sent letters, which she did not open. He asked Collins to arrange meetings, which she declined. He even appeared once outside Margaret's townhouse, where Elinor had moved temporarily, standing in the street for nearly an hour in the rain before finally departing without ever knocking on the door. "He looks terrible," Margaret reported, watching from the window, "like a man who has not slept properly in a week." "He will survive it," Elinor said, without much interest in the observation. "Men in his position generally do." She was not entirely wrong. Within 2 weeks, Edward had begun appearing again at his club, his composure slowly returning, though several acquaintances noted a new brittleness in his manner, a wariness in his eyes that had not been there before. The scandal had cost him more than he had likely anticipated, though, as Elinor had predicted, society's memory for the sins of powerful men proved shorter than its memory for the sins of the women connected to them. Elinor herself faced a different kind of scrutiny. Invitations to certain gatherings quietly stopped arriving, while invitations to others increased, as though the city's hostesses had divided themselves into two camps, those who found her too scandalous to associate with, and those who found her newly fascinating. Elinor navigated this shifting landscape with the same careful grace she had always possessed, attending the gatherings that welcomed her and simply ignoring the ones that did not. Her mother, upon hearing the news, traveled from the family estate in the countryside to be with her, arriving within a fortnight with a mixture of shock, sympathy, and quiet relief that her daughter had finally acted rather than continuing to suffer in silence. Elinor's father, a more reserved man by nature, sent a letter expressing his support and reminding her that the Hartley family had never lacked for resources, should she need them in the difficult months ahead. It was during one of these quiet evenings with her mother, sitting together in Margaret's drawing room, that Elinor finally allowed herself to speak openly about the grief beneath her calm exterior, the mourning for a marriage and a future she had once believed in completely. "I loved him," Elinor admitted quietly, tears finally falling for the first time since she had discovered the perfume on his coat, weeks ago now, though it felt like a lifetime. "Whatever he has done, whatever he has become, I loved the man I believed him to be for 6 years. I do not know how to simply stop feeling that even now." Her mother took her hand and held it firmly. "You do not have to stop feeling it all at once, my dear. Grief does not work that way, but you have already done the hardest part. You have faced the truth, and you have refused to let it destroy you. The rest will come slowly in its own time." Elinor found comfort in her mother's words, though she understood the path ahead would not be an easy one. She had left behind the security of her marriage, the title she had worn for 6 years, and the future she had once imagined for herself, and in exchange she had gained only uncertainty and the quiet respect of those who admired her courage. But as the weeks passed, and the initial shock of the scandal began to fade into the ordinary rhythm of society's gossip, moving on as it always eventually did toward some fresher scandal, Alina began to notice something unexpected growing within herself, something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. A sense of possibility. 3 months after the ball, Alina sat in Charlotte Winters's office, reviewing the final terms of her separation from Edward. The negotiations had not been simple, but Edward, perhaps out of genuine guilt or perhaps simply out of a desire to avoid further public embarrassment, had agreed to terms more generous than Alina had initially expected. She would retain a substantial income from her marriage settlement, a property in the countryside that had belonged to her own family before the marriage and had been folded into the estate agreements, and her freedom, fully and completely, to build whatever life came next without further entanglement with the Whitmore name beyond what courtesy required. "You have done remarkably well for yourself, Your Grace," Charlotte Winters said, sliding the final papers across the desk for Alina's signature. "Many women in your position walk away with far less." "I had a great deal of help," Alina said, thinking of Margaret, of her mother, of Charles Bennet's quiet, careful investigation that had given her the proof she needed from the very beginning, and perhaps a great deal of stubbornness as well. She signed the papers with a steady hand, and as the ink dried on the page, she felt something inside her settle into place, a chapter of her life closing with a finality that brought more relief than sorrow. Whatever love she had once carried for Edward had not vanished entirely, but it had transformed into something distant and manageable, a memory she could hold without it holding her in return. The countryside property, a modest but comfortable house called Ashgrove, situated among rolling hills nearly a full day's journey from the city, became Alina's home in the months that followed. She threw herself into restoring the neglected gardens, learning the names of every tenant family on the small surrounding estate, and slowly, carefully, building a life that belonged entirely to herself, unshaped by any husband's expectations or society's watching eyes. Margaret visited often, as did Alina's mother, and the quiet rhythms of country life brought Alina a peace she had not known was possible after the turmoil of the previous year. She took up painting, a hobby she had abandoned as a young woman when marriage and duty had filled every hour of her days, and found, to her own delight, that her skill had not entirely faded, only waited patiently for the chance to return. News of Edward reached her occasionally, carried by Margaret or by letters from mutual acquaintances who assumed, correctly, that Alina retained some interest in the man who had once been her husband, even if that interest had cooled into something closer to distant curiosity than love. She learned that he had settled a generous allowance on Isabel Cross and the child, a daughter born in the early winter following the ball. Though he had not married Isabel, whether by his own choice or by hers, Alina never learned for certain. She learned that his standing in society had never fully recovered, that certain doors remained closed to him that had once opened easily, that the whispered story of the ball at Camden House followed him into rooms he entered for years afterward, a permanent stain on a reputation he had once guarded so carefully. Alina found she could hear this news without the sharp pain that would have accompanied it a year earlier. Edward's fate, whatever it turned out to be, no longer felt like her responsibility to mourn or celebrate. She had built her own life, separate and complete, and his consequences belonged to him alone now, the natural result of choices he had made long before she ever threw that ring at Isabel Cross's feet. A year after the ball, Alina received an unexpected letter from Isabel Cross herself, the first and only direct communication between the two women since that night. Alina considered not opening it, uncertain what purpose such a letter could serve after everything that had passed between them, but curiosity eventually won out over caution. The letter was brief, written in the same confident, sloping handwriting Alina remembered from that first devastating note discovered so long ago. Isabel wrote to apologize, simply and directly, for her part in the pain Alina had suffered, acknowledging that whatever story she had told herself at the time to make her choices bearable, she understood now the full weight of what she had participated in. She wrote of her daughter, a bright and healthy child, and of her own decision to leave the city entirely, to build a quiet life for herself and her child far from the society that had once fascinated her so completely. Alina read the letter twice, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions she could not entirely untangle, and in the end, she wrote back a short, measured reply, neither warm nor cold, wishing Isabel and her daughter well in whatever life they built for themselves. She did not know if the two women would ever correspond again, but she felt, sending that reply, a final closing of a door that had remained slightly open in her mind since the night of the ball. It was during the second spring at Ashgrove that Alina met Henry Caldwell, a widowed gentleman farmer whose land bordered her own estate, a quiet and thoughtful man, nearly a decade her senior, who had lost his wife to illness several years earlier. Their acquaintance began simply enough, over a matter of a shared boundary fence that needed repair, and grew slowly over the following months into something neither of them had expected nor sought out. Henry was nothing like Edward. He possessed none of the practiced charm, none of the polished society manners that had once dazzled Alina as a young bride. He spoke plainly, worked his own land alongside his tenants rather than merely collecting their rents, and treated Alina from their very first meeting as an equal, a woman of intelligence and capability rather than an ornament to be admired and managed. Their friendship deepened gradually, built on long conversations over tea in her restored gardens, on shared interests in the well-being of their tenant families, on a mutual understanding of loss and rebuilding that neither of them needed to explain to the other in great detail. Alina found herself, for the first time since the collapse of her marriage, beginning to imagine a future that included another person, though she took great care to move slowly, unwilling to repeat the mistakes of a marriage entered into too young and too dazzled to see clearly. Margaret, visiting one summer afternoon and observing the easy comfort between Alina and her new neighbor, could not resist a knowing smile. "He looks at you the way a man looks at someone he genuinely sees, Alina, not the way Edward once looked at you, as though you were simply part of the scenery of his life." Alina considered her sister-in-law's observation carefully. "I am in no hurry, Margaret. I have learned at great cost the value of patience and clear eyes. If something is meant to grow between Henry and myself, it will grow in its own time, without either of us forcing it into a shape it is not ready to take." 2 years after the scandal at Camden House, Alina Hartley, no longer Duchess but simply herself, married Henry Caldwell in a small, quiet ceremony at the parish church near Ashgrove, attended only by close family and a handful of dear friends, including Margaret, who wept openly through the entire service, and Alina's mother, who declared it the happiest day of her daughter's life, happier even than her first, grander wedding had ever truly been. The Whitmore name faded gradually from Alina's daily life, though it never entirely disappeared from the story people told about her, the woman who had thrown her ring at her husband's mistress before the eyes of all society, who had walked away from a dukedom with her head held high, and rebuilt a life entirely her own. Some told the story as a warning, others as an inspiration, but Alina herself had long since stopped concerning herself with how others chose to frame her past. She had learned, through every painful step of that first terrible year, that dignity was not something granted by a title or a marriage or society's approval. It was something she carried within herself, something no betrayal could take from her unless she allowed it, something that had guided her through the worst months of her life, and out the other side into something better than she had ever imagined possible. On quiet evenings at Ashgrove, sitting beside Henry in the garden she had restored with her own hands, watching the sun set over the hills that now belonged to the life she had built for herself, Alina sometimes thought back to that terrible morning when she first caught the scent of unfamiliar perfume on her husband's coat. She no longer felt the sharp grief of that discovery, only a distant gratitude for the strength it had forced her to find within herself, the strength that had carried her from that hallway in Camden House all the way to this peaceful garden, to this quiet happiness she had built entirely on her own terms. She had lost a title, a name, and a life she once believed would last forever, but she had gained something far more valuable in its place, a full and honest understanding of her own worth, independent of any man's regard, and a life shaped entirely by her own choices rather than the expectations of others. That Elinor had come to understand was worth more than any ring, any title, any grand house filled with candlelight and false promises. It was worth everything. 5 years passed at Ashgrove, and the quiet house that Elinor had once restored alone now rang with the laughter of children. She and Henry had welcomed a son first, a sturdy, curious boy named William who took after his father in temperament, steady and thoughtful, and then a daughter, Grace, whose bright curiosity and quick wit reminded Elinor often of the young woman she herself had been, long before marriage and betrayal had taught her the harder lessons of the world. Elinor watched her children grow with a fierce and grateful joy she had never expected to know, having spent 6 barren years in her first marriage believing motherhood might never be granted to her. She often thought, in quiet moments, of how strange life's turns could be, that the very collapse of everything she once thought she wanted had led her, eventually, to everything she had never known to hope for. She had kept in occasional, distant contact with Margaret over the years, their friendship enduring long after the formal ties of family had dissolved. Margaret wrote often of the city, of the shifting fortunes of the families they had once known together, and it was through one of these letters, in the autumn of Elinor's 5th year at Ashgrove, that she learned of Edward's final decline. He had never fully recovered his standing after the ball, Margaret wrote, and in the years since, poor decisions with the estate's finances, made increasingly without the steady counsel Elinor had once quietly provided behind the scenes more than either of them had perhaps realized at the time, had left the Whitmore estate in a far weaker position than it had once held. Edward had grown reclusive, rarely seen at the gatherings that had once filled his calendar, and word had reached Margaret that his health, too, had begun to suffer under the weight of years spent in regret and isolation. Elinor read this news with a complicated stillness in her chest, neither the satisfaction of vindication nor the sharp grief of old love, but something quieter, a kind of distant sorrow for the man he might have been, had he made different choices all those years ago. She did not write to him. There was nothing left to say that either of them had not already said, in that drawing room, in that great hall, in the silence that had followed her final departure up the grand staircase of Camden House. Isabel Cross, Elinor learned through the same letter, had indeed built the quiet life she had once written of, settling in a coastal town far from the city, where she raised her daughter, now a bright child of 6 years old, away from the whispers and judgments that had once surrounded her arrival in society. Margaret mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Isabel had recently begun corresponding with a respectable merchant in her new town, a widower with children of his own, and that there was hope among those who still thought of her fondly that she might yet find the settled happiness that had eluded her during her time in the city. Elinor found herself hoping the same, without reservation. Whatever pain Isabel Cross had caused her, however unknowingly or knowingly, Elinor no longer carried any desire to see that pain returned in kind. She had built her own happiness from the wreckage of betrayal, and she found she wished the same possibility for every woman who had been caught, in one way or another, in the web of Edward's deceptions. On a bright afternoon that autumn, Elinor sat in her garden watching William and Grace chase each other across the lawn while Henry worked nearby among the roses, his sleeves rolled up, his hands in the soil, entirely unbothered by the fact that a man of his standing might have once been expected to leave such labor to his gardeners alone. This was the life she had built, she thought, watching him work, watching her children laugh, feeling the warm autumn sun on her face. Not grand, not celebrated by society's careful attention, but entirely, completely her own. She thought sometimes of the young bride she had been, 18 years old and dazzled by a title and a handsome face, believing that love meant simply being chosen by someone important, without ever questioning whether that someone truly saw her at all. She did not regret those years entirely, for they had shaped her into the woman capable of surviving what came after, but she was profoundly grateful that her story had not ended in that drawing room, in that marriage, in that life built around someone else's priorities and desires. Margaret visited that winter, bringing with her the latest news from the city, and the two women sat together by the fire one evening after the children had been put to bed, sharing a bottle of wine and the easy comfort of a friendship that had survived every storm either of them had weathered. "Do you ever wonder," Margaret asked, watching the flames dance in the hearth, "what might have happened if you had never found that letter? If Edward had simply continued and you had never discovered the truth at all?" Elinor considered the question seriously, turning her wine glass slowly in her hands. "I have wondered that in quieter moments. I imagine I would have continued as I was, growing more distant from myself with each passing year, mistaking politeness for love and duty for happiness. I do not think I would have been unhappy, not in any way I could have named clearly. But I do not think I would have been truly alive either, not the way I am now." "You paid a terrible price for that truth," Margaret said gently. "I did," Elinor agreed. "But I have also gained everything that matters most to me because of it. William, Grace, Henry, this house, this garden, this life I chose entirely for myself rather than one that was simply arranged around me. I would not trade it, Margaret, not even to undo the pain of that first discovery." Margaret reached over and took her hand, the same gesture of comfort she had offered years earlier in her sitting room in the city, when Elinor had first arrived with news of a perfumed coat and a mysterious letter, and Elinor found, holding her dear friend's hand by the warm fire of her own home, that the circle of that painful year had finally closed completely, leaving behind not scars that ached, but simply the quiet, settled wisdom of a woman who had faced the worst and built something better in its place. Outside, snow began to fall softly over the hills of Ashgrove, and somewhere upstairs, William and Grace slept soundly in the home their mother had built with her own courage and her own hands, unaware of the storms their mother had weathered long before they were born, aware only of the warmth and safety of the life she had given them. Elinor Caldwell, once Duchess of Camden, sat by her fire with her dearest friend beside her children sleeping safely above, her husband soon to join her once his evening chores among the horses were finished, and felt, in that quiet moment, a peace so complete it seemed to fill every corner of the room. She had thrown a ring at a woman's feet one candlelit night many years ago, had spoken two simple words that shattered the careful illusion of her old life before the eyes of all society, and in doing so, had not destroyed herself as she had once feared she might. She had freed herself instead, and in the years that followed, had built something far more precious than the title and the grand house she had left behind. She had built a life that was entirely, unmistakably her own.